The crisp white envelope lay amongst the usual clutter of bills and advertisements, but something about it felt different. It bore the ominous seal of the HOA, and a shiver ran down my spine. I tore it open, my heart sinking as I read the words, "Notice of Architectural Violation." What had I done? Trimmed the hedges too enthusiastically? Planted the wrong kind of petunias? My mind raced, searching for the transgression. The letter was vague, stating that my home did not conform to the established aesthetic of the community, and demanded I remedy the situation within 30 days. There was no specific explanation, no mention of what exactly was deemed unacceptable. Confused and frustrated, I surveyed my house. It was a perfectly normal suburban home, nothing out of the ordinary. The paint was a little faded, sure, but it was still beige, wasn't it? And the landscaping was... well, it was landscaping. As I walked around my property, I noticed something peculiar. Across the street, Mr. Henderson's house was painted a bright, cheerful yellow. Down the block, Mrs. Higgins had a penchant for lime green trim, and yet no one was sending them violation notices. A flicker of suspicion ignited in my mind. I started observing my neighbors' houses with a newfound critical eye. I noticed the oddly shaped birdhouse in Mrs. Johnson's yard, the slightly crooked fence in Mr. Davis's backyard, and the collection of peculiar lawn gnomes adorning Mr. Thompson's lawn. Yet none of these seemingly eccentric features had drawn the ire of the HOA. It dawned on me, I was being targeted. The HOA, led by the ever-vigilant Karen, was on a power trip, singling me out for some unknown reason. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about asserting control, about flexing their bureaucratic muscle. This was the final straw. I had done nothing wrong. I was a good neighbor, a responsible homeowner, and I had every right to enjoy my property without the constant scrutiny of the HOA. This was about more than just a paint job. It was about taking a stand. If they wanted aesthetics, I'd give them aesthetics. But not just any aesthetics. I'd give them HOA aesthetics. My plan was audacious, ridiculous, and absolutely perfect. I would repaint my house in the exact colors and branding of the HOA. It would be a living, breathing embodiment of their very own aesthetic, a monument to their own design philosophy. The first step was research. I meticulously combed through every piece of HOA literature I could find. Newsletters, meeting minutes, even those annoying reminder flyers about watering restrictions. I dissected their logo, a rather unfortunate combination of a house and a maple leaf, noting the exact shades of green and brown. I even managed to obtain a copy of their official brochure, a glossy pamphlet filled with platitudes about community harmony and architectural integrity, and of course, their official color palette. Armed with this information, I hired a professional painting crew. The crew leader, a burly man named Bob with a twinkle in his eye, looked at the paint swatches I presented. Shades of beige so bland they could put beige to shame, and raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this, buddy?" he asked, eyeing the color chart with a mixture of amusement and concern. "This looks like something you'd find in a prison cafeteria." "Trust me, Bob," I replied with a mischievous grin. "This is going to be a masterpiece." And so, the transformation began. The once ordinary beige house was stripped bare, revealing the underlying canvas. Then, the painting crew, armed with rollers and brushes, meticulously applied the HOA-approved colors. The trim was painted a shade of brown, so drab it could make a monk weep, while the body of the house was a beige so bland it could induce sleep. The attention to detail was meticulous. The garage door was transformed into a giant replica of the HOA logo, the maple leaf proudly displayed in the center. The front door was painted a shade of HOA green and adorned with the words HOA approved in a fancy cursive font. As the painting progressed, I added the finishing touches. A custom doormat bearing the inscription, "Welcome to HOA Headquarters," was placed at the entrance. I even considered installing a small flagpole with an HOA flag flying proudly in the breeze, but decided that might be pushing it. The finished product was something. It was a testament to my dedication, a monument to my defiance, and a visual representation of the HOA's own absurd aesthetic. The neighbors, initially stunned into silence, erupted in a mixture of laughter and disbelief. Some found it hilarious, others were bewildered, and a few, I suspect, were secretly impressed by my audacity. The neighborhood, once a picture of predictable suburban conformity, was thrown into a state of delightful chaos. My HOA-themed house became the talk of the town, a beacon of both ridicule and admiration. Mrs. Higgins, my green-thumbed neighbor, was the first to react. She peered over her meticulously pruned hedges, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Mark," she gasped, "what have you done?" "I've embraced the HOA aesthetic," I replied with a grin. "Don't you love it?" Mrs. Higgins burst into laughter. It's hideous. It's magnificent. It's... She struggled for words, her laughter echoing down the street. Mr. Henderson, the timid HOA president, was less amused. He stood frozen on the sidewalk, his face a mask of bewildered horror. This is unacceptable," he sputtered. This is an affront to the very principles of our community." "But Mr. Henderson," I countered, "isn't this what you wanted? A house that perfectly conforms to the HOA's aesthetic?" Mr. Henderson opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He just stood there, speechless, defeated by the sheer audacity of my creation. The rest of the neighborhood was divided. Some were horrified, clutching their pearls and muttering about property values. Others were secretly delighted, seeing my house as a symbol of defiance against the HOA's tyranny. And a few, I suspect, were simply confused. "What's going on?" a young boy asked his mother, pointing at my house. "Why is that house wearing a costume?" His mother, stifling a laugh, replied, "It's not a costume, honey. It's a statement." The HOA-themed house became a local landmark, a conversation starter, and a constant source of amusement. It was a visual representation of the HOA's own absurdity, a mirror reflecting their obsession with control and conformity. And I, the once targeted homeowner, had become the neighborhood's unlikely hero, the champion of individuality, and the master of petty revenge. Karen's reaction to the HOA-themed house was nothing short of volcanic. Picture this: a perfectly manicured Karen, hairsprayed within an inch of its life, stepping out her front door to a vision of beige and brown so bland it could make a nun scream. Her face contorted, morphing through shades of red, purple, and a rather alarming shade of puce I didn't even know existed. It was like watching a chameleon on a bad acid trip. "What in the—" she sputtered, her voice a strangled gasp. "What have you done?" Her shriek echoed through the neighborhood, sending birds scattering and squirrels diving for cover. It was a primal scream of outrage, a symphony of Karen rage unleashed upon the world. The HOA, spurred into action by Karen's meltdown, and probably a few concerned calls from the neighbors, promptly issued a cease and desist letter. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic bluster, filled with accusations of aesthetic terrorism, community disruption, and unauthorized use of the HOA logo. They demanded I repaint my house to a more acceptable color scheme, or face. Well, they weren't quite sure what they could do, but they were sure it would be unpleasant. I, however, was ready for them. I'd spent hours poring over the HOA rulebook, dissecting every clause, every bylaw, every ridiculously specific regulation. And guess what? Nowhere did it say I couldn't paint my house in HOA colors. There was no official color palette, no aesthetic guidelines, no mention of logo infringement. Armed with this knowledge, I crafted a response that was equal parts polite and condescending. "Dear HOA," I wrote, my fingers tapping gleefully on the keyboard. "I'm a bit confused. You said my house wasn't aesthetic enough. Now you're saying it's too aesthetic? I'm simply trying to comply with your vague and arbitrary standards. Perhaps you could provide a more specific definition of acceptable color schemes. Or maybe," I added with a flourish, "you could just admit that you're targeting me for no reason." I printed the letter, signed it with a flourish, and slipped it into the HOA's mailbox. Then, I sat back and waited for the fireworks. Karen, I knew, wouldn't take this lying down. She was about to call an emergency meeting, and I couldn't wait to see her face when I walked in, wearing my custom-made, proud HOA representative t-shirt. The HOA meeting was a tense affair. Karen, her face a mask of fury, stormed into the room, her high heels clicking a menacing rhythm against the hardwood floor. She slammed her purse on the table, sending a stack of papers scattering. "This is an outrage!" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the room. "An absolute disgrace, that eyesore of a house. It's an affront to everything this community stands for." The other board members, a collection of bewildered retirees and overly serious professionals, exchanged nervous glances. Karen, in her fury, had a tendency to make a scene. "This is unacceptable," she continued, her voice rising. "It's a blight on the neighborhood, a mockery of our aesthetic standards. We must take action." And with that, she proposed a new rule. A strict ban on painting houses in HOA colors. I, sitting quietly in the back of the room, wearing a custom-made t-shirt emblazoned with the HOA logo and the words "Proud HOA Representative" in bold letters, couldn't help but chuckle. This was getting good. "Hold on a minute, Karen," I said, my voice calm and collected. "Before we start banning colors, perhaps we should consider the hypocrisy of this situation." All eyes turned to me. Karen sputtered, speechless for a moment. "You claim my house is inappropriate," I continued, "yet you allow Mr. Henderson to paint his shed that hideous shade of lime green. And what about Mrs. Higgins's house? The one with the purple shutters? Does that conform to your aesthetic standards?" Karen's face flushed crimson. Those are different," she stammered. "How so?" I pressed, enjoying the look of growing panic on her face. "Are my HOA colors somehow more offensive than Mrs. Higgins's purple shutters? Is it the principle of the matter? The audacity of a homeowner daring to embrace the very essence of the HOA?" The room erupted in a low murmur of agreement. Even Mr. Henderson, usually a timid soul, seemed to be enjoying the show. Karen, cornered and humiliated, sputtered and stammered, unable to articulate a coherent defense. "This meeting is adjourned," she finally declared, her voice cracking. I need a moment." And with that, she stormed out of the room, her defeat palpable. The HOA, left to their own devices, were forced to reconsider their position. They couldn't ban me from painting my own house in HOA colors without appearing utterly ridiculous. The incident became the talk of the neighborhood. My HOA-themed house, once a source of contention, was now a symbol of defiance, a testament to the absurdity of the HOA's rules. And Karen, the once invincible queen of the neighborhood, was now a laughingstock, her reign of terror officially over. The HOA meeting was far from over. With Karen out of the room, a sense of liberation seemed to wash over the other attendees. Mr. Henderson, usually a timid mouse in Karen's presence, straightened his back and cleared his throat. "Well then," he announced, Now that we've established that Mr. Mark's unique color scheme isn't technically a violation, perhaps we can discuss a more reasonable solution. A wave of murmurs and suggestions filled the room. Mrs. Higgins, never one to miss an opportunity for a bit of mischief, chimed in. "I say we let him keep it," she declared. "It's certainly more interesting than the rest of these beige boxes." A few gasps of surprise echoed through the room, but then a surprising number of voices joined in agreement. "Yeah, it's kinda cool," someone mumbled. "It's definitely unique," another added. "And hey," a third voice chimed in, "it's certainly HOA compliant." The tide had turned. The HOA board, facing a potential neighborhood revolt, and the horrifying prospect of everyone painting their houses in HOA colors, realized they had no choice but to back down. All right, Mr. Henderson conceded, his voice a mix of resignation and relief. "The motion to ban HOA-themed houses is rejected." A cheer erupted from the room. I, sitting in the back with my proud HOA representative t-shirt, couldn't help but grin. I had won. Karen had lost. And the HOA, once a symbol of oppressive conformity, had been forced to embrace a little bit of individuality. The news of Karen's resignation came a few days later. Apparently, the humiliation of being outsmarted by a homeowner with a paintbrush and a sense of humor was too much for her to bear. She packed her bags, her perfectly coordinated luggage matching her perfectly manicured nails, and left the neighborhood in a huff. Rumor has it she moved to a gated community with even stricter HOA rules, where beige was the only acceptable color, and laughter was strictly prohibited after 9 p.m. The HOA, now leaderless and demoralized, decided to take a more relaxed approach to community management. They stopped nitpicking about minor infractions, they allowed a wider range of paint colors, and they even organized a neighborhood potluck, though they did insist on pre-approving the menu to avoid any culinary disruptions. And my house? It remained a glorious monument to HOA absurdity, a beacon of individuality in a sea of beige conformity. It became a local landmark, a tourist attraction, and a constant reminder that sometimes the best way to fight the system is to embrace its absurdity. The HOA meeting ended with a whimper rather than a bang. Karen, defeated and humiliated, stormed out of the room, her reign of terror finally over. The neighborhood, once a battleground of HOA tyranny, had blossomed into a haven of self-expression, a testament to the power of community spirit and the enduring appeal of a good backyard BBQ. But my masterpiece, the HOA-themed house, wasn't complete yet. No, I had one final touch to add, a cherry on top of this delicious sundae of defiance. I commissioned a custom flagpole, taller than any other in the neighborhood, and had a banner made, "Official HOA Headquarters." The sight of my house, now a beacon of individuality and a monument to petty revenge, was truly something to behold. Cars slowed down as they passed, tourists snapped photos, and children pointed and giggled. The HOA, once a symbol of oppressive conformity, had become a source of amusement and a symbol of the power of the individual. The HOA never bothered me again. They learned their lesson, a hard and colorful lesson. My house, once a target of their ire, became a symbol of resistance, a testament to the power of creativity and the enduring appeal of a good old-fashioned rebellion. And as I sat on my porch, sipping lemonade under the watchful eye of the HOA logo, I knew that I had won. The HOA might have had the rules, but I had the paint. And that, my friends, is a powerful weapon indeed.